Hope we use all this paper.
Yeah. Montag attributes their distance to Mildred's emptiness and says that if she were to die, it would not be a wife that he loved dying, but the dying of an unknown face, a newspaper image. Montag society has driven a wedge between people and even the most intimate of relationships, as Montag identifies with his critique of Mildred's family. Wasn't there a wall between him and Mildred? Literally not just one, but so far three. Montag wonders, asserting that the technology promoted by society has driven a wedge between him and his wife.
Yeah, so what are some, I think we have a lot of content criteria for success, which is good from the novel. What would you say an ideal response needs to include, like, at least hinting at what ideas?
Absolutely. So I think it needs to include, like, both of these questions. The right response is, like, Mildred and Montag do not have what we would consider like a good, healthy relationship, or like there's distance between them. So I think identifying like their relationship is broken, there's distance between them, there's no connection between Mildred and Montag.
Would you say the word distant should
necessary.
show up? Or some synonym of it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool, I like
so
that.
just naming that there's like not a connection there, a lack of connection or distance.
Yeah.
I think another thing that students need to arrive at is that it is because Mildred is empty, Mildred is unable to connect.
And you should use text to illustrate that?
Absolutely.
So in that particular moment, an ideal response would have either that quote or something, because I know there are a lot of moments from this chapter where you could like assign to this characterization.
And in the close read that we had, there were multiple places where students saw that aspect of her as a character.
Okay.
And then finally, that it has been caused by technology. And I think that's where the answer to the society piece comes in. This is
a question here.
Yes. What I noticed though, Mark, and this was something that it's hard to plan from, I've read and internalized this novel multiple times. It's hard to plan for sort of the limited exposure that students have had. And even to this point on this page, they've seen Clarice and they've heard her commentary about her school. And so they're beginning to make those connections. But I think I just need to be more intentional about helping students realize Mildred is a reflection of the larger society. Because I think that gets lost upon them, especially when we're looking at like segmented pieces of the text. They see that society's messed up in terms of like Clarice's perspective. They see that Clarice is different, but I think they tend to get sort of laser focused when it comes to Mildred.
Well, yeah. Keep going. I have an idea.
So they'll talk a lot about how she's obsessed with technology and she's obsessed, but they don't see her so much as a reflection of the larger society. And I'm noticing like some of my more advanced readers are seeing it, but some students are struggling to make those connections.
So are you afraid that that's going to not show? Does that need to show up here in this response?
I think it should, based on my question. I think it may not.
Cool. Let's just put that. I think that is the next phase here is like, let's identify misconceptions. Where could kids go wrong? Have you looked at these yet?
I have not.
That's awesome. That's great. So predict for me and us, like where can a student make a mistake? What would that look like for this response?
The most obvious one is just like not answering all components of the question.
Great.
And there are a lot of pieces to these questions. So missing.
And answering all components in the assertion?
Yes.
Cool, keep going. We'll eventually revisit this list after we look in to see what new misconceptions do we know to think about as we plan forward.
Absolutely. Another misconception that students had, that I think I worked through questioning sequence to clarify, was this idea that Mildred and Montag's relationship was once strong and good. Like kids kept coming back to this idea of he wants the old Mildred back. I mean, I think part of that came from our close read of the scene with the technicians. He talks about how he wishes that it was a new Mildred.
Interesting. That's a good misconception.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I tried to push them, where in the text do you see evidence that Montag misses an old Mildred? And most groups were able to arrive at the quote in this section of the text where he says, even if she had died, he wouldn't have been sad. And so they were able to make sense of like, oh, there never really was a connection here. One group actually pulled out the piece of evidence that said, you know, he had called them relatives from the first. So, and resonated, or like, kind of tried to understand where he refers to Mildred as a little girl. Some groups were able to figure out, like, oh, he didn't even know her as a little girl. Like, he's always seen her as a little girl. They never had a real marriage. So some groups were able to arrive at that.
Cool. So those are two, I think, or that one in particular is a good content misconception. Are there any other content misconceptions specifically related to some of these CFS that we named? You know, that they need to know that they don't have a relationship, which I think that sort of affects that.
I think another thing that could happen is students either make the assertion that like Mildred is empty and that's why they don't have a connection, or make the assertion like it's because she's obsessed with technology because they don't have this connection. But I think it's going to be difficult for students to marry the two. I think they were able to like conceptualize that in discussion, but I don't know if it's going to be captured
So
here.
I think it's just one or the other instead of knowing this.
Yeah, or maybe even just naming one or the other, without the like additional level of complexity of like, this is why she's empty, or this is a reflection of her emptiness.
Cool. Those are great, like I said, content misconceptions. Those are general, like, writers transferable misconceptions that we might see here.
Yeah, I think students are still just struggling with like using the interpretation to bridge evidence to the assertion. So looking at interpretations.
That's a good one.
Making sure they're not like just restating whatever the evidence says, or stating whatever the assertion says without actively trying to connect the two.
Cool.